My brother and I just wanted a quiet drink after closing a case. Instead, a woman in a visor decided we didn't belong. She waved over her private security like we were criminals. Within a week, she was filing false police reports on us. 6 months later, she pushed it too far at a community event. By then, we already knew exactly what she'd been hiding, and the badge in my pocket wasn't the twist she expected. What happened that night ended her reign for good. My name is Marcus Carter, and I've spent 9 years chasing people who think rules don't apply to them. My twin brother Malcolm does the same job. Same badge. Same quiet exhaustion. We bought a house together in Brookstone Estates because the schools were good and the commute was short. Neither of us imagined the HOA itself would become our next case. Brookstone looked like a postcard. Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, a clubhouse with a bar nobody ever seemed to actually use. Malcolm joked it felt like a movie set. I just wanted somewhere peaceful to come home to after 12-hour shifts. We didn't want trouble. Turned out, was already waiting for us at the welcome sign. The first thing we noticed was how quiet the neighborhood got whenever we stepped outside. Curtains shifted mid-stride. We chalked it up to small-town nerves, the kind any new face gets. We were wrong about how deliberate that silence actually was. Deborah Holloway ran Brookstone the way some men run small countries. She'd been HOA president for 11 years, re-elected every time because nobody else wanted the fight it would take to challenge her. Neighbors called her Debbie to her face and something sharper behind her back. She noticed everything. She forgot nothing. Our neighbor Yvonne Price, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived on our street since the subdivision broke ground, brought over a peach pie the week we moved in. She lingered at the door longer than the pie required. "Welcome to Brookstone," she said carefully. "Just keep your paperwork organized." "All of it." I asked Yvonne what she meant. She glanced toward the Holloway house at the end of the cul-de-sac before answering. "Deborah likes things a certain way," she said. "And she likes deciding who fits that way." She didn't elaborate further, but the warning sat with me longer than she probably intended. Within our first week, a laminated notice appeared on our door about trash bin placement, a rule we hadn't yet been given in writing. 2 other houses on the street had bins out too. Ours was the only one photographed and cited. Malcolm shrugged it off as a fluke of bad timing. At the mailboxes, a man introduced himself as Tyler, Deborah's son, and head of what he called the volunteer patrol. He wore a polo with an embroidered Brookstone shield, sunglasses pushed up on his head even in shade. He looked us over the way a bouncer sizes up a line. "New here," he said. Not a question. Tyler's patrol wasn't official security, just neighbors with radios and a truck. But Deborah had given it a badge-shaped logo and unofficial authority nobody had voted on. Residents mostly ignored it. We would learn that ignoring it wasn't really an option once Deborah decided you were worth watching. The clubhouse newsletter that month featured Deborah's photo on the cover, captioned "Protecting Brookstone's Values Since Day One." Inside, a section titled Community Reminders listed grievances with unnerving specificity. A basketball hoop, a flag flown one day past a holiday, a car parked 6 inches over a line. Every violation traced back to the same handful of houses. Malcolm pointed out, half joking, that the cited houses all belonged to the neighborhood's few Black and Latino families. I told him not to read too much into it yet. We'd both built careers on evidence, not assumptions. But the pattern nagged at me longer than I wanted to admit. We met Frank Doyle at the clubhouse bar, a squat brick building attached to the pool house that doubled as Brookstone's only watering hole. Frank owned it, poured drinks himself most nights, and mentioned within 5 minutes that Deborah was his sister-in-law. "She keeps this place civil," he said, like it was a compliment. Civil, we'd soon learn, meant a very specific definition. Frank kept a laminated list behind the bar of preferred hours for certain residents, an arrangement nobody had voted on either. He never called it what it was. He called it keeping the peace. We just called it Tuesday. Deborah herself finally introduced herself 3 weeks in, cornering us in the parking lot with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You boys settling in all right?" she asked, eyes flicking over Malcolm's truck. My jacket, the moving boxes still in the driveway. "Just fine," Malcolm said. She didn't blink. "We run a tight community here," Deborah continued, tapping her clipboard. "I like knowing who's who." She asked, almost casually, what we did for work. I said government contracting, which was true enough for a doorway conversation. She wrote something down anyway. I didn't like how long that took her. That night Malcolm and I compared notes the way we do with any subject. Out of habit more than suspicion. Selective enforcement. Personal patrol. Like a surveillance log. None of it was illegal on its own. All of it made the hair on my neck stand up anyway. Yvonne told us more over coffee a few days later. Deborah had chased out the Amati family 2 years back over a satellite dish violation nobody else got cited for. Before that, a young black couple left after 18 months of complaints about their loud gatherings, which turned out to mean birthday parties. The first real spark came on a Friday. Malcolm and I finally had a night off together and decided to grab a drink at the clubhouse bar. Still in our work clothes, badges tucked away out of habit rather than secrecy. We just wanted 2 beers and a quiet corner table. Frank served us without much comment, though his eyes kept drifting toward the door like he was expecting someone. We didn't think much of it until Deborah walked in 20 minutes later with Tyler trailing behind her, both of them scanning the room like they were counting heads. Deborah's gaze landed on our table and stayed there. She whispered something to Tyler, who immediately pulled out his phone. I caught the words "not on the list" drift across the room. Malcolm raised an eyebrow at me. Neither of us had heard of any list requiring clubhouse entry. Frank suddenly remembered an urgent task behind the bar, refusing to meet our eyes. 2 men in matching black polos walked in through the side door minutes later. Brookstone patrol stitched over the pocket. They weren't law enforcement. They didn't need to be. Not with the confidence Deborah had handed them. "Gentlemen, can I see your resident cards?" one of them asked, standing a little too close to our table. We hadn't been issued resident cards. Nobody had mentioned needing one. Malcolm calmly explained we'd closed on our house 6 weeks earlier and hadn't received any card in the mail. Deborah appeared at the man's shoulder like she'd been waiting in the wings for her cue. "We've had reports of non-residents using clubhouse amenities," she announced, loud enough for nearby tables to turn. "I just want to keep everyone comfortable." Comfortable, apparently, didn't include us finishing our drinks in peace. I kept my voice level and asked what report, specifically, had been filed. Deborah's smile tightened. "Just a general precaution," she said. You understand. I understood plenty. I understood that our neighbors 2 tables over, both white, hadn't been asked for a single card all evening. Malcolm slid our closing documents up on his phone. Proof of address dated weeks earlier. Deborah barely glanced at the screen. Documentation can be forged, she said breezily. I'm sure you understand our caution. The bar had gone fully silent by then, every eye pretending not to watch. Tyler hovered behind his mother's shoulder, hand resting near his belt like he wanted us to notice the gesture. It wasn't a weapon, just posture, but it was calculated posture, meant to make 2 grown men feel smaller in a room they'd paid dues to enter. It didn't work the way he hoped. We left rather than escalate a public argument over drinks that weren't worth our badges or our patience. Walking out, I heard Deborah tell someone nearby, "Better safe than sorry." That's all. As if she'd done something admirable instead of humiliating in front of half the neighborhood. Yvonne caught us in the parking lot, apologizing on behalf of a woman who'd never once apologized for anything herself. She does this, Yvonne said quietly. Every new family that doesn't look like her get the resident card treatment. The Ahmadis got it. Now you too. Malcolm wanted to file a formal complaint with the HOA board that same night. I told him to wait, to document everything first, the way we document any pattern before moving on it. It wasn't fear. Our jobs had trained into both of us for years. The next morning, a notice appeared taped to our door, a formal warning for disorderly conduct at the clubhouse, signed by Deborah Holloway herself, HOA president. No incident report existed. No board vote had occurred. Just her signature and her word treated as if it carried the weight of law. I called the property management company listed on our HOA paperwork, hoping for a neutral third party. The woman who answered sighed audibly at Deborah's name before I'd even finished my sentence. She files a lot of these, she admitted. Most people don't fight it. It's easier to just move. That phrase stuck with me. It was the quiet machinery behind every empty house we'd noticed on our block. The ones with fresh paint and no history anyone wanted to discuss. Deborah wasn't just difficult. She was running a system, patient and repeatable, disguised as neighborliness. Malcolm suggested, only half joking, that we pull our own resources and look into her. I reminded him we had actual casework waiting at the office, cases with real victims and real deadlines. Still, neither of us could quite shake the feeling that Brookstone's tidy lawns were hiding something uglier underneath. That weekend, an email went out to the whole neighborhood titled, "A Note on Clubhouse Etiquette," written in Deborah's unmistakable voice. It didn't name us directly. It didn't have to. Our Friday night knew exactly who certain unfamiliar guests referred to. The warnings didn't stop at one notice. Over the following 2 weeks, we received citations for a mailbox flag angled wrong, a trash bin left out 90 minutes past pickup, and grass supposedly a half-inch over height that Malcolm had personally mowed that same morning. Each one photographed with theatrical precision. I started keeping a folder, old instincts kicking in whether I wanted them to or not. Photos of our lawn beside photos of neighbors' identical lawns that received no citations. Timestamps. Malcolm called it overkill. I called it Tuesday, same as Frank's arrangement, just for a different purpose. Tyler's patrol truck began idling outside our house most evenings around 6. Engine running, headlights aimed at our porch like a spotlight. He never got out. The message transmitted just fine through a windshield and an idling engine parked exactly where he knew we'd see it. We tried the official channel first, requesting time at the monthly HOA board meeting to raise concerns about selective enforcement. Deborah, who chaired the meetings herself, informed us the agenda was full and suggested we submit our concerns in writing, through the proper form, a form that conveniently required her personal approval to be read aloud. At the meeting itself, held in the same clubhouse where we'd been humiliated weeks earlier, Deborah opened with a lengthy segment praising community vigilance. She gestured at a slide showing crime statistics from a city 40 minutes away. Statistics that had nothing to do with Brookstone but everything to do with fear. A board member named Harold Voss, the only one who ever seemed uncomfortable with Deborah's theatrics, caught my eye across the room and gave the smallest shake of his head. It wasn't much. Not everyone in that clubhouse agreed with what was happening. After the meeting, Harold approached us quietly by the parking lot lights. She runs unopposed because nobody wants what happened to the last person who ran against her, he said. I asked what happened. Ask around, and walked to his car without looking back. We asked around. Told us she'd challenged Deborah for the presidency 3 years earlier and lost. Then found herself hit with 4 citations in a single month, followed by an anonymous complaint to her employer about supposed HOA dues fraud that took her weeks to disprove. Priya moved out 6 months after that. It wasn't worth my sanity, she told us over the phone, voice tired in a way that suggested she'd told the story before and it never got easier to tell. Deborah doesn't lose. She just makes losing so expensive nobody tries twice. Malcolm and I started noticing smaller things too. The kind you only catch when you're actually looking. Deborah's SUV parked outside houses that weren't hers late in the evening. A folder she carried everywhere, thick enough to hold more than HOA minutes. She guarded it like it mattered more than the meetings themselves. One evening Tyler's patrol truck blocked our driveway entirely for 20 minutes while he checked on a report, giving no explanation for what report or from whom. Malcolm asked to see it in writing. Tyler smirked and said paperwork took time, the exact phrase Deborah had used about our resident cards. A citation arrived alleging unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in our driveway, referring to Malcolm's government-issued sedan, a vehicle with plain plates that nothing about it screamed commercial. Every other unmarked work vehicle on the block, all belonging to white neighbors, sat citation-free in identical driveways up and down the street. I finally lost some patience and called the county non-emergency line to ask whether HOA patrols had any legal authority to issue anything resembling citations at all. The dispatcher laughed, not unkindly. Legally, no. Practically, people don't know that, so it works anyway. That answer explained everything and solved nothing. Yvonne warned us Deborah's real weapon wasn't the citations themselves but the fines attached. Small individually, crushing in accumulation. She doesn't need you gone today, Yvonne said.
She just needs you tired enough to leave on your own before.
We decided, against instinct, to simply pay the fines rather than fight each one individually, keeping every receipt, every notice, every timestamp in that growing folder. Malcolm called it patience. I called it evidence collection. The exact skill set our jobs had spent years sharpening into something close to instinct. Deborah, sensing no visible reaction from us, seemed to interpret our silence as weakness rather than strategy. The citations increased in frequency. A new one arrived alleging our porch light violated approved fixture guidelines, despite it being the same model installed on 6 other houses on our own street. Tyler grew bolder too, knocking on our door one Saturday morning under the pretext of a welfare check requested. He claimed, by an anonymous neighbor. No neighbor existed. We knew because we'd already started quietly asking around ourselves. The same instinct that made us good at our actual jobs. That Saturday knock rattled Malcolm more than he let on. He'd stayed calm through worse in the field. He told me later, but something about a stranger showing up at your own front door under false pretenses hit differently when the badge wasn't yours pointed at someone else for once. I suggested installing a doorbell camera, less for evidence and more for peace of mind. Within a week, it had recorded Tyler's truck idling outside 4 separate times, twice past midnight, engine running, no reason given, no complaint filed that either of us could ever locate through official channels. Deborah's newsletter that month included a section on reporting suspicious activity, illustrated with a stock photo unmistakably meant to evoke exactly the kind of person she decided we were. Neighbors mentioned it to us awkwardly at the mailbox, half apologizing, half pretending they hadn't noticed the implication either. We reached out to a lawyer friend, off the record, just for general guidance. She confirmed HOA boards had real authority over dues and covenants but almost none over policing behavior, and definitely none to authorize private citizens to demand identification from residents. This isn't governance, she said. This is theater with a badge shape. Armed with that, Malcolm drafted a formal cease and desist letter regarding the resident card demands and unauthorized citations. Deborah's response arrived within 2 days. A certified letter accusing us of harassing HOA volunteers and threatening escalation to a lien against our property for unpaid fines we'd already paid in full. We had the receipts. Every fine, paid and documented, sat in that folder with timestamps that contradicted her claim entirely. Malcolm wanted to march straight to the board meeting with it. I told him timing mattered more than satisfaction, and that Deborah's mistakes were only useful once she'd made enough of them. Around this time, a young couple 2 streets over, the Delgados, mentioned similar treatment starting for them, right down to the resident card demand at the clubhouse bar. It wasn't just us. Deborah's pattern simply repeated itself on anyone who didn't fit her picture of Brookstone. Harold Voss reached out again, this time by email, cautiously worded but clear enough. He mentioned discrepancies in HOA financial reports he'd flagged internally for 2 years running. Discrepancies Deborah always explained away with vague references to reserve fund adjustments. Nobody on the board had the appetite to question further. That word, reserve fund, snagged something in my memory from an entirely unrelated conversation at the office weeks earlier. One about small community associations and skimmed dues nationwide. I didn't say anything to Malcolm yet. It was probably nothing. I've learned to distrust that word. Probably. Frank's bar, meanwhile, kept a curious habit of technical difficulties whenever we showed up. The tab machine mysteriously down, the good beer mysteriously out, the patio mysteriously closed for cleaning. It was petty. 1,000 tiny doors closed just quietly enough to avoid ever being provably discriminatory. Malcolm suggested we simply stop going to the clubhouse bar altogether, cut our losses, drink at home. I refused on principle, partly stubbornness, partly the quiet professional conviction that backing away from Deborah now would only confirm to her that pressure worked exactly the way she intended it to work. Deborah escalated again, this time filing a complaint with our actual employer, listed vaguely on paperwork as federal contractor, alleging unspecified, concerning behavior in a residential setting. Our supervisor called, more amused than alarmed, having seen this exact HOA tactic used against agents before in other jurisdictions. She's fishing, our supervisor said. Wants to see what shakes loose. Don't give her anything to work with. That advice, oddly, matched exactly what we already told confidential sources under pressure. Say nothing you don't have to. Let the other party's impatience do the talking for you eventually. We noticed Deborah's folder again at the next board meeting. Thicker than before. And this time she referenced it openly while discussing problem residents. Reading names aloud from a list that included ours alongside the Delgados and 2 other families, all conveniently sharing a certain unspoken characteristic between them. Harold objected publicly for the first time, asking what criteria determined the list. Deborah brushed him off with practiced ease. Citing community feedback, she declined to specify further. The meeting moved on quickly. Nobody else spoke up. Her learning was Brookstone's most reliable renewable resource. Afterward, in the parking lot, Harold admitted quietly that he'd requested full financial records twice and been denied both times. Told the documents were being audited by an accountant Deborah selected personally. An accountant who, turned out, shared a last name with Frank Doyle's wife. That detail landed differently once I heard it out loud. Family running the bar. Family running the books. Family running the patrol through her son. Deborah hadn't built a neighborhood association. She'd built a small, tidy, self-reinforcing machine, and every lever inside it answered only to her. Malcolm and I began, carefully and off-duty, cross-referencing publicly available business filings for the management company handling Brookstone's dues. Nothing illegal jumped out immediately, but the ownership structure looped back through 2 shell entities to addresses that matched Deborah's own house and Frank's bar, which struck both of us as one coincidence too many. We reminded ourselves, out loud, more than once, that this wasn't our case, wasn't our jurisdiction, wasn't worth the risk of overstepping boundaries we'd built entire careers respecting. It was just curiosity. Just 2 guys protecting their own front porch. That's what we told ourselves. Anyway, for a while longer, Tyler's harassment took a sharper turn when he began photographing us directly, phone raised without pretense whenever we stepped outside, uploading images, we later learned, to a private neighborhood group chat captioned with commentary neither flattering nor subtle about who exactly belonged on Brookstone streets and who did not. A neighbor, embarrassed, forwarded us screenshots of that group chat without being asked. Deborah posted in it too, rarely subtle, once writing, keeping an eye on our newer additions. You all know why beneath a photo of Malcolm simply walking to his own mailbox in broad daylight. That screenshot, more than any citation, made something in me go cold and very still. The particular stillness that comes right before you stop reacting emotionally and start reacting professionally instead. I filed it in the folder. I didn't mention the feeling to Malcolm. He didn't need to see it in my face either. We consulted, quietly, with a civil rights attorney a former colleague recommended, who confirmed the group chat alone could support a fair housing complaint depending on pattern and intent. She asked how many other families had experienced similar treatment. We told her about the Amatis, the young couple, Priya, the Delgados. That's not isolated conduct, she said. That's a documented pattern spanning years. And patterns are exactly what makes these cases winnable. For the first time since Brookstone had welcomed us with a laminated warning notice, something like hope, careful and unhurried, started to take shape in that growing folder of ours. For a stretch of about 3 weeks, things went strangely quiet. No new citations arrived. Tyler's truck stopped idling outside our house each evening. Even Frank seemed to remember how to pour a beer without technical difficulties interrupting service halfway through our order at the bar. Malcolm wondered aloud if Deborah had simply lost interest, moved her attention elsewhere the way bullies sometimes do when a target stops flinching. I doubted it. Lose interest. They recalculated. Experience rarely means peace. It usually means somebody's changing strategy behind the scenes. We used the calm to actually enjoy the house we'd bought, hosting a small cookout for Yvonne, Harold, and a few of the neighbors who'd quietly shown us kindness since we moved in. Priya even drove back for it, laughing that she hadn't set foot in Brookstone since her own departure 2 years earlier. Over burgers, Priya mentioned something new. A rumor that Deborah had recently taken out a private loan against her own house. An odd detail for a woman who spoke constantly about Brookstone's financial discipline. Harold's eyebrows rose at that. He hadn't heard it either, and Harold usually heard everything. Yvonne brought up something older. A resident from years back, long since moved away, who'd once accused Deborah of pocketing HOA landscaping funds for a project that never actually got completed. Nothing came of the accusation at the time. The man simply left Brookstone shortly after making it. These weren't proof of anything, just scattered fragments from different corners of the neighborhood's memory. But fragments have a way of forming a shape once enough of them accumulate in one place. I added each detail to the folder anyway, professional habit overriding any pretense that this was purely personal now. Malcolm and I finally admitted to each other, over dish duty that same night, that we'd both been quietly running informal checks on Deborah and the management company for weeks, neither one telling the other, both slightly relieved to discover we weren't the only one who couldn't quite let it go. We agreed to keep it strictly off the books. Nothing official. Nothing that touched our actual caseload. Just 2 private citizens exercising the same curiosity any homeowner might about where their dues actually went. That boundary felt important to maintain, even if neither of us fully trusted how long it would hold. Harold called a few days later, voice tighter than usual. He'd finally gotten a partial financial statement released after months of requests, and one line item stood out immediately: a 6-figure consulting fee paid annually to a company neither he nor any other board member recognized or had ever voted to approve. The company's name traced back through the same public filings Malcolm and I had already found, to that same tangled ownership structure looping through Deborah's address and Frank's bar. Harold hadn't made that connection himself yet. When we told him what we'd already found, His silence lasted a long time. She's been billing the HOA for her own management company, Harold finally said, through a name none of us would recognize. And none of us ever approved it in any vote I remember sitting through. The peace and quiet felt, suddenly, a great deal less peaceful in hindsight. We agreed, carefully, to let Harold pursue this through proper board channels rather than involve ourselves directly, at least for now. Our jobs demanded a wall between personal grievance and official process. A wall we both still respected even as the itch to dig further grew harder to ignore. Deborah, unaware of what Harold had uncovered, resurfaced at the next casual neighborhood gathering with unsettling warmth, complimenting our landscaping, asking about Malcolm's job with a friendliness neither of us trusted for a second. Predators go quiet before they strike. We'd both seen that particular calm before, in far worse settings. Brookstone's Fall Festival is coming up, Deborah mentioned brightly. At the clubhouse, of course. I do hope you boys will finally feel welcome enough to join us properly this time. The word finally landed with deliberate weight. An invitation wrapped tightly around an old grievance she clearly hadn't forgotten at all. Malcolm and I exchanged a glance neither of us needed to translate aloud. Something about that invitation. Too warm. Too specific. Too eager. Told us the quiet 3 weeks hadn't been peace at all. It had been Deborah building momentum toward whatever came next. And we both felt it coming. The fall festival arrived with string lights and a rented popcorn machine. Brookstone's annual attempt at looking like the postcard it pretended to be year-round. Families gathered on the clubhouse lawn while Frank ran the bar inside. And Deborah moved through the crowd like a mayor working a re-election campaign. We showed up as invited, cautious but determined not to give her the satisfaction of visible unease. Yvonne stuck close by our side most of the evening, and Harold gave us a small, knowing nod from across the lawn that suggested his own investigation had continued quietly in the background. Deborah approached us within the first 20 minutes. Champagne flute in hand, voice pitched just loud enough for nearby ears. "So glad you two finally feel part of the community," she said, before adding, almost as an afterthought, "Tyler mentioned some concerns about your work schedules. Odd hours for contractors." I kept my answer deliberately vague. The same doorway conversation answer I'd given weeks earlier. Deborah's smile thinned at the lack of new information. She hated not knowing things about people. Hated it in a way that seemed to physically itch at her whenever a question went unanswered to her satisfaction. Tyler drifted over next. Phone raised again under the pretense of festival photos. Lens pointed a beat too long in our direction each time. Malcolm finally asked, evenly, whether Tyler needed something specific from us. Tyler smirked, said just documenting the community, and walked off without waiting for a reply. Priya, who'd come back for the festival at Yvonne's invitation, later admitted Deborah had cornered her too, asking pointed questions about who she'd been talking to lately, a clear fishing expedition for whatever Harold might have shared. Priya, wisely, said nothing beyond pleasantries and excused herself quickly. The evening wound toward its scheduled highlight, a community awards segment Deborah hosted personally every year, handing out laminated certificates for things like Best Yard and Most Improved Landscaping. It was corny, harmless, exactly the kind of small-town theater that made Brookstone's darker undercurrents easy to overlook for newcomers. Deborah took the small stage, microphone in hand, and thanked everyone for keeping Brookstone safe and welcoming this year. A phrase that curdled slightly in my ears given everything we now knew. Applause followed anyway, polite and automatic, the way applause always follows whoever's holding the microphone at these things. As the awards wrapped up, Deborah's tone shifted, subtly but unmistakably. "I also want to remind everyone," she said, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed squarely on us, "that Brookstone takes security seriously. We've had some concerns lately about unfamiliar faces at our events." The crowd's attention followed her gaze directly to Malcolm and me, standing near the popcorn machine with drinks we hadn't finished. Yvonne stiffened beside us. Harold's jaw tightened across the lawn. Deborah had just done publicly, in front of the entire neighborhood, exactly what she'd been doing privately for months. "I'd like our patrol to just confirm everyone's residency tonight," Deborah continued, gesturing toward Tyler, who signaled 2 more men in matching polos to fan out across the lawn. "Just a formality, for everyone's safety. Nobody else got approached first. Nobody else ever did, in this particular formality of hers." Tyler walked straight toward us, ignoring 3 other unfamiliar faces closer to the entrance, guests of neighbors nobody had ever questioned before tonight. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough for the whole festival to hear, "mind confirming your residency for us? Just following protocol tonight." Malcolm's voice stayed level, though I could hear the edge underneath it, the same edge I recognized from every interview room we'd ever sat across from someone lying to our faces. "We live 4 houses down," he said. "You've been to our driveway more times than you've been invited." Deborah stepped closer, sensing an audience forming, clearly enjoying the theater of it more than the substance. "There's no need for hostility," she said sweetly, loud enough for the crowd behind her. "We just like to be thorough with newer residents. I'm sure you understand our caution." "We've lived here 5 months, I said, keeping my own voice deliberately calm despite the growing crowd of onlookers pretending not to watch too closely. "Longer than some of the people you've never once asked for identification." Deborah's smile didn't waver. It just sharpened at the edges instead. "Well, if you have nothing to hide," she said, "showing a resident card should be simple enough."
I reminded her,
Again, that no such card had ever been issued to us. A fact she'd been told before and conveniently forgotten each time it became inconvenient to remember. Tyler's hand drifted toward his belt again. The same gesture from the clubhouse bar months earlier, except now dozens of neighbors stood watching instead of a half-empty room. Someone near the front raised a phone, recording. Deborah didn't notice, or didn't care, riding the momentum of her own performance too hard to stop. "We're going to need you 2 to step aside from the festival," Tyler announced, loud enough that the string lights practically seemed to dim under the sudden hush. "Just until we can verify things properly." Malcolm and I exchanged a look. This was, unmistakably, the escalation we'd both quietly expected. "On what authority?" Malcolm asked, still calm, still measured, the exact tone we used with suspects who thought volume equaled leverage. Deborah answered before Tyler could. "HOA bylaws grant the board authority to maintain order at community events," she said, an answer that existed nowhere in writing anyone had ever shown us. Harold pushed through the crowd at that point, visibly frustrated. "Deborah, there's no bylaw provision for anything like this," he said. You're inventing authority in front of 40 witnesses. Deborah's eyes flicked toward him with something colder than annoyance. Something closer to warning. Harold. This isn't the time, Deborah said tightly. I'm handling a security matter. Harold didn't back down. For maybe the first time since we'd met him. There is no security matter, he said. There's a woman targeting the same families she's targeted for years. And everyone here knows it. A ripple moved through the crowd at that. Murmurs. Glances exchanged between neighbors who'd clearly noticed the pattern themselves but never said it out loud in public before tonight. Deborah's composure cracked. Just barely. A flicker of genuine fury replacing the practiced sweetness she usually wore like armor. That's enough, she snapped, dropping the sugary tone entirely. Tyler, escort them out. Now. Forward. Actually reaching for Malcolm's arm. A decision he would come to regret far more than he understood in that particular moment. Standing under string lights in front of the whole neighborhood. Malcolm stepped back calmly. Hands raised slightly. Voice steady in a way that only years of training could produce under pressure like this. Don't touch me, he said. You have no legal authority to detain anyone. And you're about to make a very serious mistake in front of a lot of witnesses. Serious mistake, Deborah scoffed. Is trespassing at a private community event after repeated warnings. I finally spoke up, loud enough for the crowd to hear clearly. We're residents. Invented. And everyone here just watched you order your son to physically detain a paying homeowner. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. No longer just whispers but open conversation. Several neighbors now openly filming with their phones raised. The exact kind of audience Deborah had built her entire reign avoiding rather than courting. She hadn't expected pushback with this many witnesses present at once. Yvonne stepped forward then, voice shaking but clear. She did this to the Amadis. She did it to that young couple before them. She did it to Priya. And I should have said something sooner instead of just bringing pie and warnings. Priya, standing near the back, called out too. She did it to me. Fabricated fines because I ran against her once. The crowd's attention shifted rapidly. No longer centered on us alone but spreading outward across years of quiet grievances finally surfacing at once. Deborah's face had gone rigid. The polished HOA president mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. Something that had clearly been there the entire time beneath 11 years of laminated newsletters and community awards ceremonies. This is a coordinated attack, she said.
You're all being
Manipulated by who? Harold asked pointedly. By the paper trail I've been building for 2 years? By the consulting fee nobody voted on? Deborah, I think it's time this board finally saw your full financial records. Tonight, in front of everyone, instead of behind closed doors like always. The mention of financial records visibly rattled her in a way the accusations about us hadn't. A small but telling difference that Malcolm and I both noticed immediately. Professional instinct kicking in even amid the chaos of a neighborhood festival unraveling in real time under string lights. This isn't the venue for board business, Deborah said quickly, attempting to reclaim control of a room that had clearly already slipped from her grasp. Tyler, get these men out of here so we can enjoy the rest of the festival like adults. Nobody moved to help him this time. Tyler reached for Malcolm again. More forcefully now. Frustration replacing his earlier bravado. Malcolm sidestepped smoothly, years of training making the motion look almost effortless, and simply said, "Last warning. Don't put your hands on a federal officer." The words landed across the lawn like a dropped glass. The crowd went silent in an entirely different way than before, the kind of silence that comes from genuine shock rather than polite discomfort. Deborah's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, nothing coming out that resembled her usual command of any room she entered. "Federal officer," she repeated, the words sounding foreign in her own mouth, like she was testing whether they might dissolve if she said them slowly enough. Malcolm didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Across the festival lawn did all the remaining talking for him. Tyler froze mid-reach, hand hovering awkwardly in the space where Malcolm's arm had been a second earlier. Frank, watching from the clubhouse doorway, went visibly pale, the bar rag still clutched in his hand like he'd forgotten what task it was originally meant for. "You're lying," Deborah said finally, though her voice had lost every ounce of its earlier certainty. "You said you did government contracting. You never said anything about being federal agents." I answered evenly. "You never asked directly. You just decided who we were the moment we walked in 5 months ago." Harold stepped closer, something shifting in his expression, part vindication, part genuine alarm at what this new detail might mean for everything he'd already uncovered about the HOA's finances. "Federal officers," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Deborah, do you understand what that might actually mean for you right now?" Deborah's composure, the armor she'd worn for 11 years of laminated citations and clipboard authority, finally cracked open in front of the entire neighborhood. "This changes nothing," she insisted, though her voice wavered on every word. "I run this community. I decide who belongs here. You decided based on our skin, not our behavior," Malcolm said, calm but unmistakably firm now, the accumulated weight of 5 months finally given room to land in front of every witness who'd ever stayed quiet before tonight. "That's not community management. That's exactly what it looks like." A neighbor near the front, someone we'd barely spoken to before, spoke up unexpectedly. "She's right. Times now and never said anything." "I'm sorry." Agreement. A slow, uneven wave of neighbors finally admitting what they'd quietly known all along. Deborah rounded on the crowd now, something desperate creeping into her tone. "You're all going to believe strangers over 11 years of service to this community?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer, louder than anything anyone could have said aloud in that moment. Tyler, seeing his mother's control evaporating, tried a different tactic, addressing us directly with forced politeness. "Look, obviously there's been some miscommunication tonight. Let's just, everyone, take a breath here." Malcolm looked at him steadily. "You reached for a federal officer twice tonight. That's not miscommunication." Frank finally emerged from behind the bar, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Deborah, maybe we should just let people go home," he said, voice small in a way it never sounded while pouring drinks for favored patrons and denying service to everyone else without explanation. "Nobody's going anywhere," Deborah snapped, some final reserve of authority flaring back to life. "I want to see actual identification, badges, whatever you claim to carry. Right now." since apparently that's what tonight has become. Her voice cracked slightly on the last few words. Malcolm glanced at me, a silent question passing between us the way it always did before either of us made a call neither wanted to make alone. I gave the smallest nod. Some situations called for restraint. This one, 5 months in the making, finally called for something else entirely. You want to see it, Malcolm said quietly, reaching slowly into his jacket. You'll see it. The crowd leaned in almost imperceptibly, the string lights overhead suddenly feeling less like festival decoration and more like a spotlight for whatever came next in front of the entire neighborhood. Before he could finish the motion, Harold interrupted, holding up his phone. Actually, wait, he said. Before badges, before any of that, I think everyone deserves to see something else first. He turned his screen toward the crowd, the financial statement glowing under the string lights. This is the consulting fee I mentioned, Harold said, voice carrying now with newfound confidence. Paid annually to a company that traces back through public filings to Deborah's own address and Frank's bar ownership. Nobody on this board ever voted to approve it. I checked the minutes myself. Twice. Deborah's face drained of color entirely, faster than it had over the words federal officer moments earlier. That's an audit in progress, she said quickly. It's not what it looks like. Harold shook his head slowly. I've had this for 3 days. Deborah. It's exactly what it looks like. The crowd's attention split now between two separate revelations unfolding simultaneously. The badges still tucked half-drawn in Malcolm's jacket and the glowing phone screen in Harold's hand. Both threads pulling at the same tangled knot that had apparently been Brookstone's true governance the entire time. Deborah looked, for the first time since we'd met her, genuinely cornered. The clipboard authority and laminated warnings suddenly worth exactly nothing against a phone screen and a jacket pocket she hadn't anticipated colliding at the exact same community festival she'd scheduled herself. Something shifted in her expression then, fear curdling fast into something colder and more calculating. The same look I'd seen on cornered people right before they stopped playing defense entirely. This is a setup, she said, voice rising. You two came here specifically to destroy this community, didn't you? We came here to live, I said. You're the one who built a surveillance operation around trash bins and skin color. Deborah's eyes narrowed, something genuinely unhinged entering her voice now as the crowd's earlier sympathy curdled visibly into open suspicion aimed squarely back at her instead of us. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Deborah hissed, low enough that only those closest could hear it clearly. Malcolm caught it anyway, professional instinct sharpening instantly. Interfering with what? Deborah? He asked. She didn't answer, but something in her face answered for her regardless. Tyler grabbed his mother's arm, urgency replacing his earlier bravado entirely. Mom, we should go, he said quietly, glancing nervously at the crowd, at Harold's phone, at the half-drawn jacket pocket that suddenly represented every consequence he'd never once considered possible 5 months ago. Deborah shook him off, something reckless taking over now that composure had fully abandoned her. I built this community from nothing, she announced to the crowd, voice rising toward something closer to a threat than a defense. I decide who threatens it. And right now, that's them. She turned toward Tyler, something feral in her instructions now. Call the real police, she said. Tell them we have 2 armed men making threats at a community event. Tell them exactly that. The crowd gasped audibly, several phones still recording every word of what she'd just openly instructed. Deborah. Don't, Harold said sharply, stepping between her and Tyler. You're about to make this so much worse for yourself. She ignored him entirely. Focus narrowed entirely on us now. Something desperate and dangerous replacing every careful calculation she'd maintained for 11 years running Brookstone's tidy little kingdom. Tyler hesitated, phone in hand, clearly uncertain for the first time all evening. Mom, they said federal officers, he said quietly. If that's true, calling it in as armed threats could. Deborah cut him off. Do it, she snapped. Or I'll do it myself right now. Malcolm's voice cut through the tension. Calm but unmistakably final now. Go ahead and call, he said. Local dispatch has our unit on file. This gets resolved a lot faster with actual law enforcement than it will with a homeowners association pretending it has jurisdiction it's never had. Something in that specific phrase, unit on file, seemed to land harder than anything said so far. Deborah's bravado wavered visibly, the reckless momentum finally hitting the wall of a reality she couldn't spin, couldn't citation, couldn't laminate her way out of in front of 40 recording phones. You're bluffing, she said, though the certainty had drained entirely from her voice. Federal agents don't live in HOA subdivisions. I almost laughed at that, despite everything. Federal agents live everywhere regular people live. Deborah. That's rather the point of blending in with a neighborhood. Harold, seizing the moment, addressed the crowd directly now instead of Deborah. I'm calling an emergency board session, he announced. Tonight, this week, whenever we can gather quorum. Every family affected by selective enforcement over the years, please, come forward. I think we finally have enough for real accountability. Priya stepped forward first, then Yvonne, then, hesitantly, 3 other neighbors we barely recognized, each one adding a name, a date, a fine, a story that had sat quietly for years waiting for exactly this moment to finally surface in front of witnesses who could no longer look away. Deborah watched her own community assemble evidence against her in real time, something breaking visibly across her expression. The mask of 11 years. Finally shattering under the combined weight of a financial statement, a half-drawn badge, and a crowd that had simply stopped being afraid of her all at once. This is exactly the kind of mob mentality I've spent years protecting this neighborhood from, she said, grasping for one final version of the narrative that had always worked before tonight. Nobody responded. Very different weight than the silence from earlier in the evening. Tyler lowered his phone slowly, not calling anyone, staring at his mother like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in longer than either of them probably wanted to admit, standing there under string lights with 40 neighbors watching every second of it unfold. Mom, he said quietly, what's actually in that consulting fee? It wasn't the question of a co-conspirator anymore. It was the question of someone realizing, in real time, exactly how much he'd been used as the enforcement arm for something he'd never fully understood himself until this exact moment. Deborah didn't answer him either. Instead, she turned and walked briskly toward the clubhouse doors, Frank trailing anxiously behind her, both of them retreating from a crowd that had, for the first time in 11 years, simply refused to disperse quietly at her command. Malcolm and I exchanged a glance. This wasn't over. Not by any measure either of us recognized from years of watching cornered people make exactly this kind of exit. Cornered people don't retreat to regroup peacefully. They retreat to destroy whatever evidence still remains within reach. We followed at a measured distance. Professional instinct overriding any temptation to simply enjoy the moment of public vindication unfolding behind us. Harold caught up beside us. Phone still recording. "She's going for something in that office," he said. "I've seen that walk before. After every audit request I've made. Inside the clubhouse. Past the bar Frank had abandoned mid-shift. A small office door stood slightly ajar. Filing cabinet drawers already half open. Deborah knelt beside them, pulling folders rapidly, stuffing papers into a tote bag with shaking hands that betrayed far more panic than her earlier composure had ever shown. "Deborah," Harold said from the doorway, voice steady now in a way it hadn't been all evening. "Destroying HOA financial records in front of witnesses is not going to help whatever situation you think you're currently managing." She didn't stop. If anything, her movements grew faster, more frantic. Malcolm stepped into the doorway calmly. Badge finally fully drawn now. The credential wallet catching the office's fluorescent light in a way that made the moment feel suddenly, unmistakably real to everyone still gathered watching from the hallway behind us. "Special Agent Malcolm Carter," he said evenly. "And that's my brother, Special Agent Marcus Carter. We haven't been investigating you specifically, Deborah. Not until about 4 minutes ago. But destroying records right now would be an excellent way to change that very quickly." Deborah froze completely, folders still clutched against her chest. The fight finally, visibly draining out of her posture all at once. "You're actually federal agents," she said. Voice small now in a way none of us had heard from her across 5 entire months of citations and clipboard authority. "We are," I confirmed. "Financial Crimes Division. Actually, though tonight was never supposed to involve any of that. We just wanted a beer at our own clubhouse bar 5 months ago. You're the one who turned that into something much bigger than either of us intended." Harold stepped forward, gently but firmly took the tote bag from her unresisting hands. "These records belong to the HOA," he said. "And given what you just tried to do with them, I think it's time an actual accountant, one not related to Frank, takes a very close look." Deborah sank slowly into the office chair behind her desk. The 11-year performance finally, completely over. "I didn't do anything the board didn't already approve," she said weakly. An argument that convinced nobody in the room, least of all herself, judging by how hollow the words sounded leaving her mouth. "The board never approved a consulting fee to a shell company traced back to your own address," Harold said. "You forged approval into minutes I personally attended, Deborah. I remember exactly what we voted on that night. And it wasn't this." Malcolm, ever measured even in the middle of a personal vindication 5 months in the making, kept his tone entirely professional. "We'll need those records secured properly," he said. "And given tonight's threats against federal officers, we'll also need a statement from you regarding what you instructed your son to do." Tyler appeared in the doorway then, pale, shaken, looking younger than his polo shirt and clipboard authority had ever suggested he actually was. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "to nobody in particular. About the money. I mean, I just thought we were protecting the neighborhood." That's all she ever told me. Deborah looked at her son for a long moment, something like genuine regret briefly crossing her face before hardening back into practiced composure. Tyler, go home, she said. This doesn't concern you. Tyler didn't move. For the first time all evening, he stayed exactly where he was, unmoved by her instruction. It concerns me plenty, he said. I've been driving around this neighborhood harassing people for you for 2 years because you told me it kept us safe. Turns out you were just protecting money you were stealing from the same people I was harassing. That concerns me a whole lot. Actually, the crowd outside the office had grown. Neighbors filtering in from the lawn, drawn by the commotion despite the festival technically continuing without its host anywhere near the string lights or popcorn machine anymore. Priya and Yvonne stood together near the doorway, watching years of grievance finally reach some kind of resolution. Deborah's eyes swept the gathered faces, calculating one last time whether any version of charm or authority might still salvage the moment. Nothing in the room responded to her the way it once had. 11 years of quiet compliance had simply, all at once, run entirely out. I want a lawyer, she finally said. Voice flat now, all pretense of community stewardship abandoned entirely. Fine, Malcolm said. You're entitled to one. Records on every fine issued to residents who share certain characteristics over the past several years. Frank, still hovering near the bar entrance, tried to slip quietly toward the exit. Harold caught his arm gently but firmly. Not so fast, he said. Your name's on half these filings too, Frank. I don't think tonight ends with you just walking home like nothing happened here. Local police arrived roughly 15 minutes later, summoned not by Deborah but by Harold, who'd made the call the moment records started disappearing into a tote bag. Officers took statements methodically, cross-referencing what Malcolm and I could officially confirm about our own roles once local jurisdiction became involved directly. Deborah sat in the clubhouse office throughout, silent now in a way that felt almost stranger than her earlier fury had, the full weight of 11 years finally settling visibly onto her shoulders as officers documented the scene around her, without any laminated notice able to intervene this time. Word spread through Brookstone faster than any newsletter Deborah had ever circulated herself. By the time officers finished their initial statements, half the neighborhood had gathered outside the clubhouse, watching quietly as the woman who'd controlled every laminated rule for 11 years sat waiting for an entirely different kind of consequence. Yvonne squeezed my arm gently as we stood outside. I should have said something years ago, she said. For every family before you. I told her it wasn't her fault, that people like Deborah build systems specifically designed to make speaking up feel more dangerous than staying quiet. Priya, watching from a few feet away, finally exhaled something that looked like real relief after 2 years of carrying an old grievance nobody had validated until tonight. I always wondered if I'd imagined how bad it was, she admitted quietly. Turns out I didn't imagine any of it. Malcolm and I stepped outside briefly for air, the festival string lights still glowing overhead, absurdly cheerful against everything that had just unfolded beneath them. Didn't expect our night off to end like this, Malcolm said. I almost laughed. I told him. That's the job. Officers confirmed they'd be opening a formal investigation into both the HOA's financial irregularities and the pattern of selective enforcement affecting specific families over multiple years. Deborah, informed of this, said nothing at all, staring at the popcorn machine through the office window like it belonged to someone else's life entirely now. Over the following days, word of what happened at the festival spread well beyond Brookstone itself. Neighbors from adjacent developments reaching out to Harold with eerily similar stories about their own HOA boards, their own selective enforcement, their own consulting fees nobody quite remembered approving through any actual vote. A local news producer contacted Harold directly, having heard secondhand about the festival confrontation from someone in the crowd who'd posted video online. Harold, cautious but no longer afraid of visibility, agreed to a brief interview about HOA financial transparency. Careful not to name us or our agency directly, Malcolm and I kept a deliberate distance from any media attention, our roles requiring discretion even as the story around us grew louder each day. Our supervisor, informed of the situation, seemed less concerned about the personal entanglement and more intrigued by what the financial trail might actually reveal. Turns out, our supervisor told us during a brief call, shell companies skimming HOA and condo association dues have popped up on our radar in 3 other states this year alone. Might be worth someone taking an official look at whatever you two stumbled into completely by accident. That call changed the shape of everything quietly. What had started as 2 brothers trying to enjoy a beer at their own clubhouse bar had, through nobody's real design, intersected with something our actual jobs had already been circling from a distance for months without either of us realizing it. Harold forwarded us everything he'd gathered, formally now, since local police had opened their own case and our agency's financial crimes division had taken a genuine interest in the broader pattern. The consulting fee, turned out, was only the visible tip of something considerably larger underneath. Records showed the shell company receiving similar consulting fees from at least 6 other homeowners associations across 3 counties.
Each one managed by the same property management firm Deborah and Frank had quietly built together over nearly a decade, disguised behind rotating names and addresses.
Malcolm and I spent several evenings, off the clock technically but fully engaged professionally, reviewing filings alongside colleagues from the financial crimes unit who'd been independently investigating similar patterns for months without ever connecting them to Brookstone specifically until our accidental festival collision provided the missing link. The scale of it surprised even us. Nearly $2 million, diverted over 8 years across 7 different HOAs, funneled through consulting fees, reserve fund adjustments, and landscaping contracts that existed almost entirely on paper, propping up a lifestyle Deborah had carefully hidden behind laminated newsletters and clipboard authority. Frank's bar, turned out, functioned as more than just a clubhouse amenity. Records showed it operating as a cash-intensive front, inflating receipts to help launder portions of the skimmed funds before they moved further through the shell company's increasingly tangled financial structure. Deborah's personal loan, the one Priya had mentioned casually at the cookout weeks earlier, turned out to be an attempt to cover a shortfall after one. HOA's board finally demanded an outside audit. An audit she'd delayed repeatedly using exactly the same tactics she'd used against Harold at Brookstone. We learned, too, that the family before the Ahmadis, the man Yvonne mentioned who'd once accused Deborah of pocketing landscaping funds, had actually been telling the truth the entire time. His complaint, buried for years, resurfaced now as corroborating evidence for a pattern stretching back far longer than any of us initially suspected. Tyler, to his credit, cooperated fully once officers formally interviewed him, providing details about the patrol's activities, the group chat, the selective citation patterns his mother had directed him to enforce without ever fully explaining why certain families always ended up on that list and others never did. She told me it was about property values, Tyler said in his statement, a detail that would later surface publicly and land with a bitter irony given. Everything the investigation eventually revealed about where those supposedly protected property values had actually been quietly draining toward for years. Deborah, for her part, retained a lawyer and said little else publicly, though internal HOA emails later recovered showed her explicitly instructing Frank and the accountant to keep the paperwork vague enough that nobody asks the wrong questions, a phrase that would feature prominently in eventual charging documents. The board, shaken but finally functional without Deborah's controlling presence, voted unanimously to suspend her HOA membership privileges pending the outcome of both the criminal investigation and a newly launched civil review into every fine and citation issued during her 11-year presidency. Priya's old fines were among the first flagged for reversal, along with the Ahmadi's satellite dish citation and the young couple's noise complaints, each one re-examined now under a lens that finally acknowledged the pattern everyone in Brookstone had quietly known about but never dared to name aloud until the festival. Yvonne, appointed to a temporary oversight committee alongside Harold, took to the role with the same careful precision she'd once brought to grading essays, cross-referencing years of citations against resident demographics with a thoroughness that made even seasoned investigators take notice of her findings. Malcolm and I, meanwhile, found ourselves formally read into the broader investigation, our accidental discovery treated less as a conflict of interest and more as valuable groundwork once our supervisors understood how directly Brookstone connected to the multi-state pattern already under review before any of this started. You two really can't just live somewhere quietly, our supervisor said, half exasperated, half amused, during a debrief that stretched later into the evening than either of us expected. Malcolm shrugged. The neighborhood had other plans for us entirely. Media interest grew steadily as details emerged. Careful reporting focused on the financial fraud rather than our own identities. Exactly the discretion our roles required even as the story of the confrontation itself continued circulating widely online, framed increasingly as a lesson in unchecked HOA overreach. Deborah's attorney attempted, briefly, to frame the entire situation as a personal vendetta orchestrated by federal agents with a grudge, a narrative that collapsed quickly once financial records demonstrated the fraud predated our arrival in Brookstone by nearly 6 years, untouched by anything resembling personal motive on our part. Frank, facing separate charges related to money laundering through the bar's inflated receipts, began cooperating fairly quickly once his own legal exposure became clear, providing details about the shell company structure that further corroborated everything Harold's financial records had already suggested independently. The accountant, Frank's wife's relative, also began cooperating, describing a system built carefully over years to stay just below thresholds that typically triggered automatic audits. A system that had worked precisely because nobody with real authority had ever pushed hard enough to look closely until Harold finally did. Community meetings, once dominated entirely by Deborah's agenda and laminated newsletters, transformed almost unrecognizably within weeks. Residents speaking openly for the first time about years of quiet fear, selective enforcement, and the exhausting calculation of which complaints were even worth raising against someone who always seemed untouchable. Harold, elected temporary board chair by unanimous vote, initiated a full independent audit of HOA finances going back a full decade, alongside a formal review process. For every citation issued under Deborah's presidency, with particular attention paid to patterns previously ignored by a board too intimidated to ask questions. Malcolm and I attended one of these meetings, invited rather than summoned this time, greeted with something we hadn't experienced in Brookstone before: genuine warmth, unforced and uncomplicated, the kind that comes only after a community collectively survives something it should never have had to endure in the first place. "We failed you both," Harold said publicly during that meeting, addressing us directly in front of the gathered residents. "We failed the Ahmadis. We failed Priya, whose names some of us barely remember now. That ends with this board, starting tonight." Priya, present again for this particular meeting, was formally offered restitution for the fines that had driven her out 2 years earlier, alongside a public apology from the board that, while overdue by years, still visibly moved her in ways her earlier composure hadn't quite allowed at the festival. The investigation widened further over subsequent weeks, financial crimes agents from 3 additional states joining what had become a coordinated multi-jurisdiction case, each one bringing forward homeowners associations that had unknowingly funneled money through the same tangled web Deborah and Frank had built over nearly a decade together. Tyler, cooperating fully throughout, avoided the harshest potential charges, though he faced his own separate legal reckoning for the group chat and the years of selective enforcement he'd personally carried out, however unknowingly, on his mother's behalf across the entire length of Brookstone's manicured little streets. "I keep thinking about all the families I photographed," Tyler admitted during one interview, voice heavy with something that sounded, for the first time since we'd met him, genuinely like remorse rather than performance. "I thought I was protecting something. I was just protecting her. This whole time." Deborah's formal arrest came on a quiet Tuesday morning, agents arriving at the same tidy house at the end of the cul-de-sac where she'd once cornered us in the parking lot with a clipboard, the same driveway where laminated citations had once appeared like clockwork against every rule that mattered only selectively. Neighbors watched from windows and porches as she was let out. No clipboard this time, no laminated authority, just handcuffs and the particular stillness of someone realizing, perhaps for the very first time in 11 years, that consequences had finally caught up with every carefully constructed excuse she'd relied on. The charges were substantial: wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering conspiracy, and, separately, a civil rights complaint filed jointly by the Ahmadis, Priya, the Delgados, and the young couple who'd since resettled 2 states away, each one finally given standing to pursue what Deborah's authority had long made feel impossible. Frank faced his own charges alongside her. The bar's liquor license suspended pending investigation. The preferred hours list finally exposed publicly for exactly what it had always represented beneath its polite, laminated framing as simple community courtesy extended selectively to whoever Deborah decided deserved it. Malcolm and I testified before a grand jury regarding the festival confrontation, our statements corroborated by dozens of phone recordings from neighbors, who'd once stayed silent out of fear and now, collectively, provided some of the most damning evidence in the entire multi-state case against her. "It's strange," Malcolm said to me one evening, reviewing case files at our own kitchen table in the house we'd almost given up on entirely months earlier. "We came here to get away from work. Instead, work found us anyway. wearing a visor and carrying a clipboard the whole time. The grand jury proceedings moved faster than either of us expected. Prosecutors eager to consolidate the multi-state fraud case before Deborah's legal team could fragment it across jurisdictions. Harold provided testimony about the falsified board minutes. His meticulous 2 years of documentation finally serving the exact purpose he'd built it for. Priya's testimony, calm and devastating in its specificity, detailed the exact sequence of fines, the anonymous employer complaint, and the eventual eviction-adjacent pressure that had driven her out years before anyone else understood what pattern she'd actually survived alone and unsupported at the time. The Ahmadis, reached through the civil rights attorney now representing all 4 affected families jointly, provided sworn statements about their own departure, corroborating details about selective satellite dish enforcement that matched almost precisely the language used against Malcolm and me over our porch light and lawn height. Yvonne testified about years of quiet observation, careful and precise despite her age, describing patterns she'd noticed long before any formal investigation existed, patterns she'd chosen, out of fear, not to challenge directly until 2 federal agents accidentally forced the entire community to finally look itself in the mirror. Deborah's defense attempted several strategies in succession. First arguing selective prosecution, then attempting to shift primary blame onto Frank and the accountant, each argument crumbling progressively against the sheer volume of financial documentation Harold and the expanded investigative team had assembled across 7 different jurisdictions. Frank, facing the reality of his own exposure, ultimately accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Deborah, describing in detail how the bar's inflated receipts had functioned specifically to launder skimmed HOA funds before they moved onward through the shell company's increasingly elaborate paper trail. She always said the ends justified the means, Frank testified, voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone finally free from years of complicity. He'd apparently never fully reconciled himself to carrying, even while pouring drinks and denying service under her direction for nearly a decade running. The accountant, similarly cooperating, walked prosecutors through the exact mechanism of the fraud, explaining how consulting fees had been calibrated deliberately to stay beneath audit thresholds across multiple HOAs simultaneously, a system requiring careful coordination that left little room for any claim of innocent oversight on Deborah's part. Tyler's testimony, emotional and clearly conflicted, provided the investigation's clearest window into how thoroughly Deborah had compartmentalized her operation, using her own son as an enforcement arm while ensuring he understood almost nothing about the financial machinery his patrols had unknowingly helped protect for years. I asked her once why certain families always seemed to get more citations, Tyler testified. She told me property values needed protecting from people who didn't understand community standards. I believed her. I was wrong to believe her for as long as I did. Malcolm and I, called separately, detailed the festival confrontation and the preceding 5 months of selective enforcement, careful to keep our testimony narrowly factual despite the obvious personal weight the entire ordeal had carried for both of us since the day we'd first moved onto that quiet street. The prosecution's financial expert walked the jury through nearly $2 million in diverted funds, a presentation stark enough that even Deborah's own attorney reportedly requested a recess afterward, the numbers simply too large and too carefully documented to survive any remaining argument about honest miscalculation. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered daily, the story having grown well beyond Brookstone itself into a broader conversation about unchecked HOA authority nationwide. Several other affected communities coming forward publicly now that Deborah's arrest had demonstrated such patterns could actually carry real consequences after all. Harold gave a brief statement to press one afternoon, careful and measured despite 2 years of frustration finally finding an outlet. "This wasn't about one bad HOA president," he said.
"It was about a system that let one person operate unchecked."
Priya, increasingly comfortable speaking publicly as the trial progressed, became something of an informal advocate for HOA reform, fielding calls from journalists and affected homeowners across the country who recognized uncomfortable similarities in their own community associations' unchecked authority structures. Deborah's attorney, in a final pretrial motion, attempted to argue that the festival confrontation itself constituted entrapment by federal agents, a motion the judge dismissed swiftly, noting that Malcolm and I had simply been residents attending a community event, not conducting any investigation until Deborah herself escalated matters publicly. The defendant created her own exposure, the judge noted from the bench, by choosing, unprompted, to publicly interrogate 2 residents at a community festival in front of dozens of witnesses. That decision belongs entirely to her, not to any agency or investigation she now claims targeted her unfairly. The ruling landed hard in the courtroom, visibly deflating whatever remaining confidence Deborah's legal team had carried into that particular hearing. The carefully constructed narrative of victimhood collapsing under the same weight of witnesses and documentation that had already dismantled every prior defense strategy attempted. Jury selection proceeded carefully given the case's growing local notoriety. Prosecutors and defense both working to find panelists unfamiliar enough with the festival video, circulating online to render an impartial judgment based strictly on evidence rather than viral outrage that had already spread well beyond Brookstone's manicured borders. Opening statements framed the case in strikingly different terms. Prosecutors describing 11 years of calculated financial exploitation disguised as community stewardship. Defense attorneys attempting, with visibly diminishing conviction, to characterize Deborah as an overzealous volunteer who'd simply lost perspective somewhere along the way. The trial's early days focused heavily on financial testimony. Expert witnesses walking jurors through spreadsheets and shell company filings with the kind of methodical detail that gradually built an unmistakable picture of deliberate, sustained fraud rather than any innocent series of accounting oversights. Malcolm and I sat through much of the trial when our schedules allowed, less out of obligation and more from a need neither of us fully articulated to see the process through to whatever conclusion it eventually reached after everything Brookstone's quiet streets had put us through. Yvonne attended nearly every day, knitting quietly in the gallery, a steady presence that seemed to unnerve Deborah more than almost any single piece of testimony presented. The retired teacher's calm patience, a stark contrast to the frantic energy Deborah had once wielded so effectively against her. "She used to bring me citations personally," Yvonne told a reporter outside the courthouse one afternoon. "Now I bring myself here every morning, just to watch. Some debts take a long time to collect, but they do eventually come due, one way or another." The prosecution's case built steadily toward its strongest evidence. The recovered internal emails instructing Frank and the accountant to keep paperwork deliberately vague. Communications that left almost no room for any interpretation beyond calculated. Ongoing intent to defraud multiple homeowners associations across several years and jurisdictions. Defense attorneys attempted to challenge the email's authenticity, a strategy that collapsed within a single afternoon once forensic analysis confirmed their origin beyond reasonable dispute. Another pillar of Deborah's defense crumbling under the same methodical documentation Harold had begun assembling years before any of this became a courtroom matter. Tyler's testimony, played in part for the jury via recorded deposition, drew visible sympathy from several panelists, his account of unknowing complicity offering a human contrast to his mother's calculated conduct that seemed to resonate even among jurors otherwise unmoved by earlier testimony. The defense's final strategy centered on painting Deborah as a devoted community volunteer overwhelmed by financial pressures she'd never intended to create.
A narrative immediately undercut by the prosecution's cross-examination revealing personal luxury purchases traced directly back to diverted HOA funds across multiple communities.
Devoted volunteers don't hire lawyers to threaten homeowners with liens over fines they've already paid, the prosecutor said during closing arguments, voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom gallery. Devoted volunteers don't build shell companies. They don't launder money through their family's bar for 8 years running. Deborah sat motionless throughout closing arguments. The composure she'd once wielded like a weapon reduced now to something brittle and hollow. Watching 11 years of laminated authority dissolve under a level of scrutiny she'd clearly never imagined possible when she first started skimming those consulting fees years earlier. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. A relatively short window given the case's complexity. Though prosecutors later noted the sheer volume of documentation had made the underlying facts almost impossible to seriously dispute once every piece had finally been laid out clearly in sequence. When the verdict came, guilty on every major count, the courtroom's reaction was quiet rather than celebratory, the particular hush of a community absorbing genuine consequence rather than reveling in it. Years of accumulated fear and frustration finally finding resolution without quite yet finding relief. Deborah showed almost no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. The same practiced composure she'd maintained through 11 years of clipboard authority holding. Barely, through the final collapse of everything that authority had ever actually protected beneath its laminated, meticulously enforced surface. Frank, sentenced separately under his cooperation agreement, received a reduced term in exchange for his testimony, a resolution that satisfied almost nobody entirely but reflected, prosecutors explained, the genuine value his cooperation had provided in unraveling the broader multi-state fraud pattern. Tyler avoided prison entirely, sentenced instead to probation and mandated community service. A resolution the judge explained reflected his full cooperation and the genuine remorse evident throughout his testimony, alongside acknowledgement that he'd been, in meaningful ways, a tool rather than an architect of his mother's fraud. I hope, the judge said directly to Tyler during sentencing, that you spend the coming years actually protecting the kind of community you thought you were protecting all along, rather than the version your mother constructed to serve herself at everyone else's expense. Deborah's own sentencing hearing drew a packed courtroom. Priya, the Ahmadi's representative, Yvonne, Harold, and dozens of residents from the other affected homeowners. Associations all submitting impact statements detailing years of fear, financial harm, and quiet exhaustion inflicted under her 11-year reign of laminated authority. The judge, reviewing the full scope of harm across 7 jurisdictions and nearly $2 million diverted dollars, handed down a sentence substantial enough that even Deborah's attorney seemed unsurprised. Any remaining fight visibly drained from a defense that had run out of arguments long before the verdict itself arrived. As deputies led her from the courtroom for the final time, Deborah glanced once toward the gallery, toward Priya, toward Yvonne, toward Malcolm and me sitting quietly near the back. Whatever she meant by that look, none of us particularly cared to interpret it charitably anymore. Outside the courthouse, Harold addressed a small crowd of reporters and residents, his voice carrying the particular relief of someone who'd spent 2 exhausting years documenting exactly this outcome without ever being fully certain it would actually arrive. Accountability isn't always fast, he said. But it isn't optional either. Priya, standing beside him, added her own brief statement. I lost my house because I challenged the wrong person at the wrong time. I'm not getting that house back. But I am getting something I didn't have 2 years ago, which is proof I wasn't imagining any of it. Yvonne, characteristically understated, simply told reporters she planned to keep baking peach pies for new neighbors, though she admitted, with a small smile, that she'd probably drop the part of the welcome speech about keeping paperwork organized, since Brookstone's paperwork problems had finally, thoroughly resolved themselves. Malcolm and I gave a brief joint statement, careful within the bounds our roles required, acknowledging simply that accountability had finally reached a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long, and that we hoped other communities facing similar unchecked authority might find the same path forward. The reformed Brookstone HOA board, under Harold's continued interim leadership, instituted sweeping changes within months, transparent financial reporting, term limits for the presidency, an independent complaint review process, and a formal end to the volunteer patrol program that Tyler had once run under his mother's direction. Restitution proceedings began for every family affected across all 7 jurisdictions. A slow process but a real one. Fines reversed, records corrected, and in several cases, direct financial compensation for families who'd lost homes, savings, or years of unnecessary stress under Deborah's carefully constructed system. The Ahmadis, reached by phone during the restitution process, expressed something between relief and lingering bitterness, grateful for vindication but unable to fully recover the years spent believing they'd simply misunderstood some rule rather than been deliberately targeted by someone abusing unchecked authority. Priya used part of her restitution to help fund a small nonprofit offering legal guidance to homeowners facing similar HOA disputes nationwide, a project she credited directly to the strange, unexpected chain of events that began with 2 federal agents just wanting a quiet drink after a long shift. Funny how it works out, Priya told us once, months after the trial concluded. You 2 moved in trying to escape your jobs for a few hours. Instead, your jobs followed you home. And honestly, I think this whole neighborhood is better for it in the end. Malcolm and I settled back into something resembling normal life in Brookstone. The street quieter now in a genuinely peaceful way rather than the calculated, surveilled quiet Deborah had once enforced through citations and idling patrol trucks parked outside our driveway most evenings. Yvonne's peach pies became something of a neighborhood institution again, offered freely to every new family regardless of what they looked like. An easy, uncomplicated welcome finally restored to something it should have always been before Deborah decided who deserved it and who didn't. Harold, elected formally to a full term as board president in the community's first genuinely contested election in over a decade, made transparency the cornerstone of his tenure, publishing financial statements quarterly and inviting any resident to review them without needing to request anything through any gate-kept process. Frank's bar reopened eventually under new ownership. The preferred hours list quietly discarded along with the tap machine that had so conveniently broken whenever Malcolm and I walked in during those first tense months of selective, exhausting hospitality that had never really been hospitality at all. Tyler, working through his community service, spent much of it at a local legal aid clinic assisting other young people navigating consequences of decisions made under pressure from people they trusted, a form of service that seemed to genuinely resonate with him in ways his mother's patrols never had. The multi-state investigation, having started almost by accident through our own accidental collision with Deborah's fraud, eventually led to convictions across 3 additional homeowners associations, each one uncovering its own version of the same pattern: consulting fees, shell companies, and unchecked authority left quietly unquestioned for years. Our own supervisor, reviewing the case's final outcomes months later, noted wryly that Malcolm and I had somehow generated more actionable financial crimes leads from a single neighborhood barbecue than most task forces produced from 6 months of dedicated fieldwork. An observation neither of us found entirely comforting. Maybe we should just live in more corrupt neighborhoods on purpose, Malcolm joked one evening. And I told him, only half joking myself, that we'd apparently already tried the opposite approach, and it clearly hadn't worked out that way regardless of how carefully we'd chosen this particular subdivision. Brookstone's newsletter, now edited by a rotating committee rather than a single controlling voice, published a final retrospective piece on the community's difficult year, careful and honest in ways Deborah's version of the publication had never once attempted to be during her 11 years running it. Residents who'd stayed silent for years began speaking more openly at board meetings, a cultural shift Harold attributed less to any single policy change and more to the simple, hard-won knowledge that speaking up no longer guaranteed the kind of retaliation Deborah had once made feel inevitable. Malcolm and I hosted another cookout that spring, a full year after our first uneasy weeks in Brookstone, inviting Harold, Yvonne, Priya, and several newer families who'd moved in since the trial concluded, none of them ever having to face a laminated citation for a trash bin left out too long. It's strange, I told Malcolm that evening, watching neighbors mingle easily on our own lawn. How much a place can change once the fear holding it together finally gets removed. He nodded, watching Yvonne laugh with a family who just moved in 3 weeks earlier. Resident cards never once mentioned. The civil rights case, settled separately from the criminal proceedings, resulted in additional compensation for the Amadis, the young couple, the Delgados, and Priya, alongside a formal, public acknowledgement from the reformed HOA board of the specific harm caused by years of racially selective enforcement under Deborah's presidency. Deborah, from prison, reportedly requested no contact with anyone from Brookstone, a request the board honored without difficulty, having spent an entire year rebuilding something genuinely community-oriented from the wreckage her 11 years of clipboard authority had left scattered across the neighborhood's quiet streets. Frank, upon release, relocated out of state entirely, severing ties with Brookstone completely. The bar he'd once run as a quiet instrument of exclusion now operating under management that welcomed every resident equally. Exactly the way it should have functioned from its very first day of business. Tyler stayed in Brookstone, slowly rebuilding trust with neighbors he'd once photographed and harassed under his mother's direction. An uneven process but a genuine one, marked by small gestures, mowing an elderly neighbor's lawn, volunteering at community events without any clipboard or authority attached to his presence anymore. Malcolm and I, A year removed from that first humiliating night at the clubhouse bar, found ourselves genuinely settled in a neighborhood we'd once seriously considered abandoning entirely. Proof, we both agreed, that some fights were worth staying to finish rather than simply walking away from quietly. We didn't come here to fix anything, Malcolm reflected one evening on our own porch. No idling patrol truck in sight for the first time in longer than either of us could easily remember. We just came here to live. Turns out sometimes those end up being the same thing anyway. Harold, reflecting on the entire ordeal during an anniversary community meeting, credited the turning point not to any single dramatic confrontation but to the accumulated courage of everyone who'd finally decided their individual story mattered enough to add to a pattern too large for one woman's authority to outlast. The financial restitution process concluded fully within 18 months. Every affected family across 7 jurisdictions receiving compensation proportional to documented harm. A resolution imperfect but real, arriving years later than it should have for people like the Amadis and Priya who'd paid the earliest, steepest price. Brookstone's reformed governance structure became something of a case study cited by consumer advocacy groups nationally. Harold occasionally consulted by other communities, seeking guidance on building transparent, accountable HOA leadership after their own experiences with unchecked authority left them searching for a better model entirely. Yvonne, well into her 70s now, remained a fixture at every community gathering, still baking pies, still watching quietly, though her warnings to new residents had changed entirely, no longer cautioning them to keep paperwork organized but simply welcoming them home without any qualification attached whatsoever. Priya's nonprofit grew steadily, fielding calls from homeowners across multiple states, each case a little different but carrying recognizable echoes of Deborah's playbook. Selective enforcement, manufactured authority, and the quiet exhaustion designed specifically to make leaving feel easier than staying and fighting for what was rightfully owed. Malcolm and I returned occasionally, off-duty, to the clubhouse bar under its new ownership. No resident cards demanded, no technical difficulties conveniently arising the moment we walked through the door. Just 2 brothers finally able to enjoy a quiet drink in the neighborhood they'd chosen to call home. The story of that festival night circulated for years afterward in Brookstone's collective memory, told and retold at gatherings, always ending the same way, with the reminder that authority claimed without accountability eventually meets someone who refuses to simply disappear quietly the way it always expected them to. A year after the trial, standing on our own porch under a sky finally free of idling patrol trucks and laminated warnings, Malcolm and I watched the neighborhood settle into an ordinary, unremarkable evening, the kind neither of us had believed possible during those first tense, surveilled months. We'd come to Brookstone looking for quiet. We found something better instead, proof that quiet, real quiet, has to be built honestly, community by community, rather than enforced through fear by whoever happens to be holding the clipboard, the microphone, or the laminator at any given moment. Deborah Halloway's 11-year reign ended not with a single dramatic reveal, but with an accumulation of ordinary people finally refusing to stay quiet, proving that even the most carefully constructed authority eventually meets the exact thing it always feared most, a community that stops being afraid.